So, um, I thought it would be a good occasion for us, as we have a new government in the White House, to look at the history of the relationship between Israel and the United States. And I picked that period of time. I couldn't cover from 48 until now. I covered from 56 until 2000. But it will give you, I think, an indication, a solid indication about the strength of the relationship. And to show you that we are talking about bonding. There is a real bonding between the two countries. So let me start by looking at what are the United States preferences, interests, usually that concern not only Israel, but concern the foreign policy goals in general. So the US would like to preserve independence and integrity. The security of the nation and citizens, of course, is very, very important. The prosperity of the nation and its citizens, economic prosperity for the United States and other favored nations. They want to creation a better world because they see themselves as a superpower. So it's not only United States at stake, but they have higher or broader aspiration. For the same reason, they would like to maintain world leadership, to enjoy prestige, and to protect expansion of ideals or ideas. And they do this via all kind of schemes. In education, it's called Fulbright, for instance, that each and every year hundreds of Americans go out of the country, scholars and teachers, to project American values to the world. And at the same time, hundreds of scholars coming from all over the world to spend a year or a few months in the United States. So only a power, a great nation can actually afford doing this. And they do this also in business and in commerce and in politics program, and you just name it. They want to expand their ideas and to export them all over the world. The factors that are important when you are designing your policy are geography, the military needs, power. For instance, in the recent years, since September 11, 2001, it's war on terror. Economic needs, energy, power, oil, and substitute for oil. Ethnic, religious, cultural ties with the neighbors, Mexico and Canada, but also with other countries, especially in Europe and then Israel. And history. Everyone would like to learn from your own mistakes and your own achievements and then continue from there. The map of the Middle East, you can see that there are some very important players here. Egypt, a sizable country with a lot of influence, is very, very important. Oftentimes, Egyptian leaders wanted to be the leaders of the Arab world. Saudi Arabia, you can see the size, and of course, oil. Iran was on the American side, no longer. And Turkey. These are the most influential parties, I would say, in that region around Israel. And you see, tiny Israel is so tiny that the name Israel cannot appear in the size on the map, but actually it's in the sea. So compared to all these giants, Israel is really a tiny spot on the map, but still important for some reason for the United States. So why it is? Let's go back to 1956, to the 1950s. So the first president that I'm going to look at is Dwight Eisenhower, who served from 1953 until 1961, the 34th president of the United States. Eisenhower had a clash with Israel, also not only with Israel, but also with France and United Kingdom over the issue of the Suez Canal and the surprise attack that the three parties launched on Egypt without notifying the United States. Eisenhower did not like it and forced Israel to withdraw from Sinai. That was a major blow for the Israelis, who hoped to seize territory from the Egyptian on that occasions with the umbrella of France and the United Kingdom. And there's a famous declaration of Eisenhower saying, under no circumstances would the United States favor the Israelis above the Arabs or vice versa. So there was no sense to favor Israel on such an occasion where when we are talking about expansion of territory, especially when the United States is not involved. But in terms of the economy, on economic programs and so on, the United States provided Israel far more economic assistance than it did to any of its Arab countries and Arab neighbors. So not in military, but when we're talking about the economy, certainly the United States helped Israel more than other parties against what I just showed you, the statement of Eisenhower. I should also mention that Eisenhower was the chief commander, of course, of the Allies in World War II. He himself wanted to see concentration and Nazi death camp, and he himself um, wanted to watch the horror in order to learn from history. And we know that he forced the Germans to bury all the bodies that he saw on that day during this visit. So he had, I would say, a soft spot for Jewish misery and the experience that the Jews suffered under the Nazi regime from 1933 until 1945, the end of World War II. Then came JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who served for 2 years until his assassination. And with Kennedy, we see that US support of Israel is now stretching also to military. Defensive qualities, not offensive qualities. The major, or one of the major issues that Israel had to reckon with during the 1960s was the issue of the Air Force and the strengthening Egyptian Air Force. Soviet Union supported the Arab countries, and JFK authorized the sale of anti-aircraft Hawk missiles to Israel. So that was the first time that United States provided directly Israel with weaponry. And there is a famous declaration of Kennedy: "This nation, from the time of President Woodrow Wilson, has established and continued a tradition of friendship with Israel because we are all committed to all free societies that seek a path to peace and honor individual right. In the prophetic spirit of Zionism, all free men today look to a better world, and in the experience of Zionism, we know that it takes courage and perseverance and dedication to achieve it." He has some disagreements with Israel and Ben-Gurion because there is this textile factory in Dimona that Kennedy was worried about. Israel refused to join any non-proliferation treaties in the world. And Kennedy wanted that there will be inspections, American inspection, coming to visit the Dimona textile factory. And Ben-Gurion, of course, opposed to this. He was very eager for Israel to achieve a nuclear bomb at that time. And only JFK assassination stopped this nagging. Ben-Gurion, of course, tried to delay any kind of encounter, any kind of visitations. Once he was succeeded by President Johnson, Johnson did not wish to pursue this issue, and this heavy burden was lifted from Ben-Gurion's chest. He didn't want to argue with the United States. Johnson served between 63 and 69. These are the time of the Vietnam War, of course. And he had very little interest and time for the Middle East. And unlike his predecessor, he had no qualms to equip Israel and other allies with offensive weapons. Johnson said, "The United States and Israel share many common objectives, chief of which is the building of a better world in which every nation can develop its resources and develop them in freedom and peace. Most, if not all of you, have very deep ties with the land and with the people of Israel, as I do, for my Christian faith sprang from yours." Johnson explained that the Bible stories are woven into my childhood memories as the gallant struggle of modern Jews to be free of persecution is also woven into our souls. I said that he was preoccupied with events in the Southeast Asia, and only periodically it would be involved in the Middle East as such. He was concerned about the United Arab Republic. Was a short-lived unity between Egypt and Syria. The UAR intervention into Yemen. He was also troubled by Nasser's vocal criticism of the United States policies in Vietnam, which annoyed him. And he was quite troubled by the flow of Soviet arms to the UAR, which explains why he started to support Israel militarily. Israel, of course, stood by the United States on the Vietnam War. This is a bipolar world. You need to associate yourself with one or the other. You couldn't just be on the fence, and Israel stood by the United States. Of course, Johnson appreciated that. So in 1966, we see the sale of 200 Patton tanks to Israel. Patton was the most advanced tank at that time. In the same year, that same year, he agreed to the sale of 48 A4 Skyhawk jet bombers. These were not the most advanced ones that the United States had at that time, but it tremendously improved the air power capabilities of Israel. In 1967, I don't have time to tell you the story of the 67 war, but I can tell you that Israel took all the precautions to ensure that if there will be a war between Israel and Egypt and Syria and other Arab countries, this time, the United States is not going to force Israel to withdraw if Israel is going to occupy territories during that war. And on the eve of the war, Israel sent 2 emissaries to speak with the American about the pending war. One was Abba Eban, and then on the 19th minute, just in the eve of the war, Meir Amit, who was the head of the Mossad, and Amit met with McNamara, the defense minister, and McNamara told him, "Go home. You have better things to do than spending your time in Washington." So this was, I would not say a green light for the Israelis to do the preemptive attack, but it was a yellowish light, that United States give its blessing to the events that are going to spiral out of control and lead into the war. On June 25th of 1967, shortly after the war had finished, Johnson met his counterpart, the Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin. And Kosygin told him, "I can't understand why the United States wanted to support the Jews, 3 million people, when there are hundreds of millions of Arabs." And Johnson answered, "Numbers do not determine what was right. We try to do what was right regardless of the numbers." So that's a very powerful message. And this message continues until today. Johnson's policies stem from personal concerns, his friendship with leading Zionists such as Abe Fortas, Abe Feinberg, and Arthur Krim, Jewish leaders, American Jewish leaders, his belief that America had a moral obligation to bolster Israeli security, and his conception of Israel as a frontier land, much like his home state of Texas. He met Premier Eshkol, Levi Eshkol, in his Texas ranch between 7 and 8 of January 1968. They met to discuss security concerns in the Middle East. And there's a story about the 2 leaders. When Levi Eshkol arrived into the ranch, they were both of them standing on the porch, and Johnson tells Levi Eshkol, "I can take my car and travel for 3 days from one side of the ranch to another." And Levi Eshkol was a joker. He used to joke a lot. He had a very healthy sense of humor. He said to Johnson in reply, "I used to have such a car. I was able to sell it." United States needs a reliable ally in the region for strategic importance. And Israel and the United States still have shared interest, same value system that are derived from Judeo-Christian tradition. Israel still, unfortunately, is the only democracy in the Middle East. And bear in mind, when Israel started, I'm talking about early Zionism during the 19th century, the majority of the pioneers, the early Zionists, they came from Eastern Europe. They came from Russia and Ukraine and that part of the world, Poland. So their affinity, their natural affinity was to socialism, to communism, to the East. It was not an Israel decision to go with the United States. It was the Soviet decision to go with our world that made Israel no choice but to affiliate themselves with the United States. Of course, the fact that we were talking at the time about a bipolar world, an arms race between the two sides that affected also the Middle East, forced Israel into the hands of the United States. Israel needs a strong patron, still does. Always, from 48 until now, it is very important for Israel to secure someone who is strong in the world arena to be on its side. The Israeli dream has been for a number of years now, and if you visit the United States, Israel, you've seen it for yourself. The impact, the influence of the United States on the Israeli society, on its culture. You open television and you hear American all the time. You go places and you see that malls have American names and many brands are American. Many Israelis yearn to visit the United States and many yearn to become American. There's a deep appreciation of the American culture, of Hollywood, of high tech, of Facebook, of all that we sense in America. Quite similar to United Kingdom, but more. In the UK, you find some criticism of Israel. In Israel, very little. There's a growing American investment in Israel, in business, in high tech, in science, in education. There's many exchanges between Israelis and Americans. In 1968, a milestone, the sale of Phantom jet to Israel. Phantom was the most advanced aircraft at that time. And to have this on the Israeli side was extremely important for Israel. Phantom was the icon of the Vietnam War, the archetype of the third generation jet fighter design that ended service in the 1960s and served for 30 years. 30 years. This was a majestic airplane. And when Israel got it, it was a game changer to a large extent. Then we come to Nixon, 1969, until it was forced out in 1974 because of Watergate, and 73 was the watershed. 73 was watershed because of the surprise attack of the Arabs on Israel on Yom Kippur of October 1973. And the United States was there from the moment go, from the very early. United States was there for Israel, mobilized weapons, supporting the economy, providing them with secure assistance of $2.2 billion to Israel. Nixon said the United States stand by its friends. Israel is one of its friends. No hesitation. Forced out on the eve of impeachment, just to survive impeachment, just not to be in the scenario of impeachment, and succeeded by his Lieutenant President Gerald Ford. And Ford confirmed his commitment to the security and future of Israel that is based upon basic morality as well as enlightened self-interest. Our role in supporting Israel honors our own heritage. And then Jimmy Carter came in 1976 with a very different agenda. Carter, for him, is very, very important. Human rights issues, peace, extremely important to him. And he is going to change foreign policy of the United States. So he's not going to overlook dictators or authoritarian regimes. He's changed his outlook and the policy on countries like South Korea, Iran, Argentina, South Africa, and Rhodesia, Zimbabwe of today. He ended more than 30 years of political and military support to one of Latin America's most abusive leaders, President Somoza, of Nicaragua, and he clearly defined the foundation of his foreign policy. He said, "Our policy is based on an historical vision of America's role. Our policy is derived from a larger view of global change. Our policy is rooted in our moral values, which never change. Our policy is reinforced by our material wealth and by our military power. Our policy is designed to serve mankind." With regard to Israel, he said, "The United States has a warm and unique relationship of friendship with Israel that is morally right. It is compatible with our deepest religious convictions, and it is right in terms of America's own strategic interests. We are committed to Israel's security, prosperity, and future as a land that has so much to offer the world." It was based on realism, understanding the situation of Israel vis-à-vis pan-Arabism in the region, a sense, I would say, of romanticism. Israel is the biblical nation of pioneers who had turned malarial swamps into a land of milk and honey. And we've seen this sense of romanticism also with Johnson, and we are going to see it later on with other leaders. It's very much in tune with some of the values, religious values of the leaders of the United States. And there's, of course, cold political calculation, Cold War, and Israel supported, as I mentioned, United States, wherever direction United States chose to go. United States was interested to repel, if necessary, by force, any Soviet attempt to gain control over the Persian Gulf. During Carter's time, the relation with Iran became very strained. His entire presidency was dominated by the hostage crisis. You may remember, they're taking over the American embassy in Tehran. Syria was, and to a large extent still is, hostile to the United States. The United States is interested to maintain relations with Saudi Arabia because it needs the oil, and Saudi Arabia was and is the major producer and exporter of oil. The United States aimed that Israel would strike peace deals with its neighbors, first and foremost Egypt, and wanted and still wanting to some extent or another to address the Palestinian issue. With Jordan, it was a bit tricky during Carter times because Hussein was felt that he is between the rock and the hard place, could not really have a fight with Saddam Hussein. He took some sort of a neutral stand on the Iran-Iraq war and showed lack of resolve with regard to the situation in the Middle East at that time, which the United States did not appreciate. In Lebanon, as ever, always is chaos. November 1977, President Anwar Sadat went to Israel in order to strike a deal with Prime Minister Menachem Begin, with a blessing and promoting this issue by the United States, by Carter. And then Carter convenes in 1978 the Camp David summit. And after 13 days, these fateful days, the two parties were able to sign a peace treaty that has known ups and downs, but is still standing between Israel and Egypt. And that was a game changer for Israel because Egypt was the number one enemy of Israel for many, many years. Begin Sadat signed historic agreement by which Israel withdrew entirely from the Sinai Peninsula. The United States would establish monitoring posts to ensure that neither side attack each other. Israel and Egypt would recognize each other's governments and sign the peace treaty, full peace treaty, including embassy, economic relationship, commerce relationship, and so on. And Israel pledged to negotiate with the Palestinians for peace. And this is the historic photo of the three leaders at the conclusion of the discussion and signing the document. I want to cite Carter from his speech of the State of the Union, the most important speech that the president gives once a year. This is the speech that he gave in January 1980. We are working with our allies to prevent conflict in the Middle East. The peace treaty between Egypt and Israel is a notable achievement. which represents a strategic asset for America and which also enhances prospects for regional and world peace. We are now engaged in further negotiations to provide full autonomy for the people of the West Bank and Gaza, to resolve the Palestinian issue in all its aspects, and to preserve the peace and security of Israel. Let no one doubt our commitment to the security of Israel. Then comes Ronald Reagan, was the first president to state explicitly that Israel was a strategic asset to the United States, a belief he expressed even before he was elected. So things are going from good to even better from the Israelis' point of view, with the change of the president, change from Carter, the Democrat, to Reagan, the Republican. Reagan said, "Only by full appreciation of the critical role the State of Israel plays in our strategic calculus can we build the foundation for thwarting Moscow's designs on territories and resources vital to our security and our national well-being." He said that his alliance sprang from shared values. Since the rebirth of the State of Israel, there has been an ironclad bond between that democracy and this one. However, there were problems between the two sides. Sadat was assassinated in 1981 because of the peace treaty that he signed with Israel. The Palestinians felt Egypt and the rest of the world, the Arab world, had sold them out. And then we saw that there was a war in 1982 between Israel and the PLO in Lebanon, a war that ended only after 18 years, only when Barak came to power in 2000. And in 1987, the Intifada, the uprising, the Palestinian uprising in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza, that lasted 6 years until the Oslo Accords. Then came George W.H. Bush, one term, 89 to 1993, and Bush said, "The friendship, the alliance between the United States and Israel is strong and solid, built upon a foundation of shared democratic values, of shared history and heritage that sustains the life of our two countries. The emotional bond, emotional no less, emotional bond of our people transcends politics." These are bold statements, bold words. I don't know to what extent American leaders speak of other nations in such a language to the extent that it speaks about Israel. Our strategic cooperation is a source of mutual security, and the United States' commitment to the security of Israel remains unshakable. We may differ over some policies from time to time, individual policies, but never over the principle. And the principle is the bond, this bonding, unshaken bonding between Israel and the United States. And there were differences. During the Bush the father time, there were differences between Israel and the United States because the American administration was concerned with the growing settlements in the West Bank. And there was a well-known clash between the American president and Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir over settlements. And Bush threatened to freeze $10 billion in loan guarantees intended to help resettle Soviet Jewish immigrants in Israel. Remember, we are talking about Perestroika and Glasnost and the opening of the gates of the Soviet Union to Jews to go anywhere they wanted. And many went to the United States, many went to the United Kingdom, and quite many came to Israel, about 800,000. And Israel needed this loan in order to boost the economy and allow integration and absorption of the Soviet immigrants into Israeli society. And Bush threatened Shamir, "If you're not going to stop these settlements, I'm not going to give you these loans that you need so much for all the banks around the world." And under this threat, Shamir was forced to go to the Madrid peace summits in 1991, something he dreaded to do. It didn't work that bad for Israel, but Shamir didn't want to go there. And then came President William Jefferson Clinton, who served for 2 terms. And Clinton said, our relationship would never vary from its allegiance to the shared values, the shared religious heritage, the shared democratic politics, which have made the relationship between the United States and Israel a special, even on occasion, a wonderful relationship. Oslo Accords was signed in 1993, although the United States was not the motivator or the mediator for this, but the United States gave its blessing to what happened. And this is the famous picture when Bill Clinton is presiding over the signing of the accords on the lawns of the White House in September 1993. Yasser Arafat, although he had some agreements between him and Rabin, unfortunately, the Oslo Accords did not materialize into full-fledged peace, despite Clinton's very, stringent efforts to bring about peace, including a summit in Camp David. Oslo came almost to a halt on the 4th of November 1995, when a zealot, an Israeli zealot, assassinated Prime Minister Rabin from a close range. And Clinton touched the Israeli nation when he came to the funeral and gave a speech that was very emotional and touched the hearts of the Israeli public. He ended that speech with the words Hebrew, Shalom Chaver, which means hello friends or goodbye friend. Of course, speaking to the late Yitzhak Rabin. Another quote from this great friend of Israel. America and Israel share a special bond. Our relationship is unique among all nations. Like America, Israel is a strong democracy, a symbol of freedom, and an oasis of liberty, a home to the oppressed and persecuted. Camp David failed, unfortunately, and it followed almost immediately, September 2000, by the Second Intifada that lasted for another 3 years until Israel built the fence or the wall, whatever you want, between the two parties and brought suicide bombing to a halt. What was the American priorities in foreign policy during the 1990s? They accentuated peace and democratic peace. And the United States believed that for any engagement, they must exhaust all other options, diplomacy before force, not force before diplomacy. Use force only when it is needed. There must be strong public support for action and have a clearly defined exit strategy to end wars. I mean, it's, when you start war, you don't always know how to end it. So that's a major issue. The United States wanted to broaden the scope of economic interaction in the region because they believed that all parties, all countries would gain from economic integration. Oil remain a priority. Need to combat the rise of violent movements cloaked in religious garb. Promote democratic political development. In conclusion, what we've seen in this survey, in this outlook that I brought to you from the 1950s until 2000, that for 50 years, all presidents, American presidents, supported Israel. All of them supported Israel because of the shared values that the two nations have that are built on the Bible, on Judeo-Christian values, on democracy, the belief in liberty, equality, tolerance, human rights, the pursuit of happiness. So the religion is important, liberal democracy is important. The Holocaust is important more so at the start of this building relationship in the 50s and the 60s, less so now, but the issue, of course, is a constant between the two nations, and it's one of the parts that Israel and Israeli politicians hammer time and again. We don't want to be in a scenario by which any power in the world might have the power to eradicate Israel. And when there is a nation, especially a nation that is strong, that aspires to have nuclear weapons, and at the same time declares its intention to wipe Israel off the map, all Israeli leaders should be very, very concerned. There is a geo-strategic alliance between the two parties that stem from the same interests. And the interest of the United States is to exert influence over the Middle East. And Israel proved itself to be the most loyal ally that the United States has. So there are mutual needs and shared interest, and there is unbroken and unshaken trust between the two nations. You may have ups and downs between leaders, but we've seen that the bonding between the two parties has been growing strong and grows stronger even. I should also mention that there is a very strong Jewish lobby on Washington, in the capital, called AIPAC. And AIPAC is considered to be one of the strongest lobbies on Capitol Hill, together with the NRA, with the arms and the weapon industry of the United States, and some religious NGOs on Capitol. But it's still one of the strongest lobbies that exist on Capitol Hill. And there's growing commerce, business, high-tech, education synergies between the two parties. Many of the high-tech in the United States use Israeli commodities, buy Israeli startups, benefit from Israeli knowledge. You know that you open your computer, you open your cell phone, and you'll find at least one ingredient, Israeli ingredient, in each and every machine that you open. So United States is very much cognizant of all this, and this is of growing importance between the two parties. So if you're going to ask me what to expect from the Biden administration, expect positivity. Yes, there's no eye-to-eye between Netanyahu and Biden. Obvious reasons, the end game that they have to resolve the Palestinian issue is different. The Biden administration is still committed to two-state solution, and I think that Netanyahu less and less so committed to two-state solution. However, this bonding between the two nations is going to withstand these disagreements between the two parties, between the two leaders. We should look beyond Netanyahu. We should look beyond Biden. What has happened from 1948 until now is something that is special, very, very special. And I think that if you look at the US foreign policy and you look at the relationship of the US with other countries in the world, I would say that for the United States, the most important relations are with the United Kingdom. And the second most important relations are with Israel. And this is something, when we are talking about a small country of the size of the state of Massachusetts, one state of the United States, I think ranked number 14 or 15 in terms of the size of the US. The population of 9 million, and still so much of importance for the life of the United States. And of course, this bonding is of great importance for Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raphael. I think I can, from my end, let's stop sharing there. Brilliant. I'll spotlight you as well, so everyone can see you. And I found that really interesting. It was a great gallop through the 44 years of US-Israel relationships. We've got a number of questions really in the chat box. Keep them coming through, everyone. So I've got a question here. You mentioned in your talk about religion. You've mentioned a number of times the shared bonding around the Judeo-Christian religion. And Tony and Penny Kay from Sheffield asked, how important are the US evangelists in this special relationship?
They are very, very important, the evangelists. The evangelist, I don't know whether to what extent you know what the evangelists want, but evangelism believes that if we all going to be good citizens of humanity, be good people, and we all be good Christian and believe in the resurrection of Christ, then the Messiah will come. Jesus will return, because Jesus never died. And he's going to return to the Holy Land. He's going to return to Jerusalem. He's going to return to the holy places. So that's explained the bonding, the very deep-seated bonding between the two sides. The evangelism help Israel a lot. It helps Israel politically. It helps Israel diplomatically sometimes. It helps Israel economically. A lot of assistance that goes from evangelism to Israel. Many evangelists come to Israel once a year. There's a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and to Nazareth and all the holy places. Evangelism is a strong power in the United States because they're very organized. I don't know exactly how many people are there, 40 million committed evangelists or something like that. So I heard that kind of figure. But it's not only that there are 40 million, it's that they're very organized as a church. So it's a political power. They can sway a lot. Again, we're talking about political lobby on Capitol Hill. They can sway a lot of politicians, of congressmen and senators to the direction that they wish. And that explains why many Republicans kept supporting Donald Trump throughout his presidency, although he's done many, many mistakes. So evangelism is extremely important power in the United States politics, and influential also when it comes to this special bonding between Israel and the US.
Thank you. And Beth and Ciro has corrected the terminology for us. It's evangelicals. I'll hurry to Wikipedia after this and find out the difference. But so there's a couple of questions about President Carter, Jimmy Carter. One is about the fact that he encouraged Ayatollah Khomeini to return to Iran. I think I've got that. That's to do with Sadina's question. Feeling that Jimmy Carter was definitely bad news for the Iranians, as he supported Khomeini to go to Iran and he propagandized against the Shah of Iran. And that links into another question from Graham Newman of Stanmore. Why did Jimmy Carter appear to turn against Israel in recent years? So I don't know if there's any particular comment you've got about the Carter presidency.
Carter is a very Christian man. So his outlook is driven, I would say, by two major factors. One is beliefs, his religion, and the second is set of belief as a human being that, of course, are driven and impacted by his religious beliefs, but is a true liberal Democrat. I don't think there was ever a US president, certainly not after Truman, from Truman until today, that is so committed to the issue of human rights as Jimmy Carter. So many presidents speak about, especially American presidents, because of the way that they want to present themselves, they speak about human rights. But at the same time, they turn blind eye to all kinds of things that are happening that are contradictory to human rights because they serve American interests. I mean, just look at Trump and Khashoggi, the murder of Khashoggi by Salman, by the Saudi king. So they can speak endlessly lip service to human rights, but actually they don't do the work. They are not, the heart and the deed are not always the same. With Jimmy Carter was different. His heart and mind and his deeds were totally the same. He wouldn't lie on these things. He would not budge on human rights. So that explains something about his relation with Iran. He didn't like any dictatorship, and Iran under the Shah was a dictatorship. Now, why he has strained relations with Israel? For this, you need to understand what happened in Camp David in '79. When he negotiated, and Carter did negotiation, the initial negotiation between Israel and Sadat, Sadat said that he wants two things. He wants his territory back. He wants his land. He wants Sinai back. That's my land, he said. I want 100%, not 99%, 0.9, 100% of my land go back to Egypt. And he wanted justice for the Palestinians. He said, because the Arab world and my own people, the Egyptian people, will not forgive me if I'm going to sell them out, if I'm going to get my land and show nothing for the Palestinians. Begin came to Camp David. The summit was on the brink until the very last moment, till the last day of the summit, 13 days. Twice the delegation was almost went back, on suitcases. They already packed the suitcase and wanted to go back. And Carter stopped them from going twice. Stopped the Israelis, stopped the Egyptians. You're not going, you stay here. And the compromise was, Israel agreed that Egypt will have its territory back. And with regard to the Palestinians, they said we are going to open the discussions, negotiations, 5 years autonomy, we shall see, and so on and so on and so on. A delaying tactic. And the language is not of two-state solution. The language is to empower the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza to have an autonomy, which Sadat agreed to. Now, of course, Carter knows all these things, and so what happened until then? So he is very uncomfortable with the way that Israel behaved vis-a-vis the Palestinians. As far as he's concerned, Israel did not abide by its promise. And he believes in two-state solution. That's how he drives. And when Israel stopped under the leadership of Netanyahu to support two-state solution, he became more and more adamant about his demand from the Israelis. Listen, you gave me a promise here in Camp David. I want you to abide by your promises. And the just thing for the Palestinians is to stop the occupation and to have two-state solution. Let's explain the rift between Carter and Israel.
Thank you. We have another question from Tony and Penny K about you mentioned about the fact that to a large degree, what's helped the Israeli side with the US is the fact that the Soviets sided with the Arabs. And I remember that the Soviet Union was the very first country to recognize the state of Israel. And what their question is, what about since the breakup of the Soviet Union? And what's that relationship like now? And how does that play out in the whole superpower dynamics?
The Israeli priorities are very, very clear. US first. It's very, very clear. They're not going to lose the United States, and they're not going to risk anything that is going to spoil the relations between Israel and the United States. They're not going to subsidy the United States for any other power, notwithstanding how powerful that power may be. Maybe once upon a time, there'll be even greater power than the United States, say China, whatever. I don't see any Israeli leader who is going to change this thing. The United States is extremely important. All these things that we just spoke in my lecture about the shared values, it is true. It is honest. It is candid. There is shared interest between United States and Israel. Both are democracy. Both believe to one extent or another in these values of democracy: equality, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, human rights, tolerance, all these things, respect for others, the dignity of the person, all these things, free press, freedom of expression. I mean, dozens of values that are shared between Israel and the United States. You don't find them to the same extent with the Soviet Union. So yes, when Gorbachev was behaving the way that he behaved, the relationship between Israel and the Soviet Union became warmer, but never to risk the relationship between the United States and Israel. Never as a substitute. Netanyahu has, I would say, complex relationship with Putin. I'm putting this in a diplomatic way. There are some things they see eye to eye. And in Netanyahu understand Putin resolve that is greater than the American, at least in the past, I would say 10 years, vis-a-vis the Middle East. I would say that Putin was far more influential in the Middle East than any American president in the past 10 years. Netanyahu understands this, so therefore he wants Putin on his side. But to say that Netanyahu is comfortable with all that Putin says and does in his country and outside of the country, his support of the Syrian regime and so on, of course not. So Israel is open to have good relationship with any country in the world. But the priority is very clear, United States first.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about the same thing, actually, which is on the American collusion, connivance, or misinformation to Israel prior to the Yom Kippur War in '73. So I'll read out one question. There were these questions from Mark Scheinfield, apologies if I've mispronounced your name, and David Elter. What about the existence of what was known as the secret Jew room in the USA in the 70s that fed misinformation to Israel about the imminent attack of the Egyptian and Syrian armies in 1973, causing Israel to be unprepared for the war and costing Israel over 2,000 lives? I don't know if that's something you're aware of, Raphael.
Wow. You learn something new every day. I never heard this.
Okay.
I don't believe it's true. I would tag this as a conspiracy theory. And I would plead with the person who asks this question or persons who ask these questions to check their sources very, very carefully. And I, for one, it's very easy to find me on the internet. Just drop me. If you find something that's credible, that support this kind of hypothesis, please send me this information. I'd like to study that. But I never heard of this. And at present, I don't believe it's true.
Okay. Thank you, Raphael. And that concludes the questions and our time together, unfortunately, but it's time to move on. So please show Raphael your appreciation in the traditional manner.
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.